Thank you all for coming. We have about 65 minutes or 70 minutes. We want to give a maximum chance for question and answer from the highly informed audience. I want to make sure everybody has 2 pieces of paper in their hands, so you will think the Hudson Institute is very effective and organized this morning. The first piece of paper is the Hudson Institute program description, Xi Jinping in Washington, the Taiwan Factor, which is important because on the back you have the biographical sketches of the 4 of us. Parris, Chang, the main speaker, and I'll say a few words about Parris and this book he gave me 40 years ago, which actually is, well, you cannot say this about most books, but 40 years later, this book reads rather well. It's about the debate in Beijing over policy and radicals versus moderates and hardliners. Our first speaker is going to be either Easton or Seth Cropsey, depending on the passion that they feel after Parris finishes talking about his 9 points. If we go by alphabetical order, it would be Seth Cropsey. If we go by seniority, it would be Seth Cropsey. And if we go by who has written a recent best-selling book about the naval balance in Asia, it would be Seth Cropsey. On the other hand, there's a strong case for Easton going after Parris.
Let's go with Seth.
Okay. The second thing you should be sure you have in your hands to follow Dr. Parris Chang's talk is this. It's printed on 2 sides. It's 9 talking points that he has prepared to focus on the policy issues of the Xi Jinping summit visit here in Washington. So to introduce everybody very briefly, again, look at the back of your speaker information page. Parris Chang has really 3 different identities. There's 3 different Parris Changs. Number 1 is a very famous world-class pioneer scholar in the study of communist China. This was what I call the Penn State Parris Chang. And this was one of his classic books, Power and Policy in China. On the back is a picture of Parris in Beijing. He's famous for a meeting with Zhou Enlai in '72, which is fairly early. The book puts forward a thesis. He says he's trained by Zbigniew Brzezinski at Columbia, by Roger Hilsman at Columbia, who was director of intelligence under President Kennedy at the State Department, and by Doak Barnett. I was also in these same classes. I think Parris got higher grades than I did because of his Chinese language skills and other reasons as well. In this book, Parris uses captured documents. He says that the CIA and the State Department somehow obtained classified Chinese military documents in 1961 called the Gongzhou Tongxun. He uses these documents and some other documents captured by the armed forces of Taiwan in a raid on the Chinese mainland coast, and many other documents from the Red Guards. He uses these to examine how policy fights, or you might say power struggles, are waged in Beijing. And I don't know if you use the word ruthless, but I think the word ruthless would be applied. He shows how even discussions that we might think here in America were harmless, what the next 12 years should be like in American agriculture. We would not kill each other over that in the Congress. But Parris shows how in each of 5 cases, the disagreements were so severe that power struggles broke out. So, it's inscribed here to Mike Parris, 1975. Many of these policy struggles continue today. Different issues, different people, but there are quite a few books in the recent few years, including Henry Kissinger's book on China and Hank Paulson's book dealing with China, that go into the nature of power struggle. So that may be one of our topics today, hawks and doves in Beijing and how they see President Xi Jinping's summit coming to Washington. I think I might say a word about both Seth Cropsey and Ian Easton as soon as Parris is finished. And if we work out who's next, it sounds like the vote. Parris, do you vote for Seth Cropsey to be the second speaker?
Well, you decide.
Okay, so that's a vote for Ian Easton then. Okay, I decide Seth Cropsey as our second speaker, and Ian, you talk about Taiwan's defense needs and your own recent research. Okay, Parris, what about these 9 points? Why did you write these 9 points? Do you think that the summit of Xi Jinping coming to see President Obama is going to be good for Taiwan? Do you think the second Parris Chang I was going to talk about is Parris Chang, the politician, who I once went to a speech with Parris in a huge Taiwan assembly, I think 50,000 people screaming, air horns, waving signs. So I thought to myself, no, this can't be the same scholar who wrote about the power struggle in Beijing. This is a major politician with a huge following in Taiwan and his own set of unique policy perspectives about what Taiwan should do in U.S.-Taiwan relations. By the way, I forgot to mention the third Parris Chang may be the one who wrote these 9 points. The third Parris Chang has been in the executive branch in Taiwan, Deputy National Security Council Secretary General, and time as Taiwan's representative to the Middle East, in a Middle East country, and several other executive branch assignments Parris has had. So today we have a chance to see the 9 points brought out by all 3 Parris Changs, I hope.
Thank you, Mike. I'm very grateful for you to set up such a panel dealing with Taiwan. It's quite rare for Hudson to do that. This is very beginning. And I want to thank you and the Hudson Institute for doing this. This is really a rare opportunity for a defense foreign affairs analyst like me to speak on Taiwan, U.S. China relations with the 2 experts from Hudson Institute, from 2049 project, and in such a setting to American audience. I say it's a very rare opportunity. Therefore, I will be candid. I will be frank. I'll speak to the point. Well, we all know Chinese leader, Chairman Xi Jinping, will be in town, state visit later this month. And Taiwan is going to be the top of his agenda. In the last several weeks, a program of economic crisis in China, stock market plunge, all this prove that Chairman Xi has not been invincible. And his leadership authority seems to have been discredited to some extent. He's vulnerable. For that very reason, when he comes to Washington, he needs a big win. Not only for his face, but also to help him restore his leadership authority back home. Therefore, he's going to press President Obama hard on Taiwan issue. Well, as I mentioned, Chairman Xi need a big win, victory. He is going to pressure Obama for a number of things. One is that he would demand Obama to terminate arms sale to Taiwan. There's a concern that before Obama leave office next year, there's another arms sale to Taiwan, and the Chinese would not like to see that. Therefore, Chairman Xi Jinping would ask Obama to terminate arms sale to Taiwan. Two, he would ask Obama to work together with China to keep Kuomintang in power in Taiwan. In other words, Xi Jinping want United States together to interfere with Taiwan's presidential election next January. They did together in 2012 and was successful. And so China will try to do that again. Third, Xi Jinping would maneuver the United States to oppose Taiwan's de jure independence and force Taiwan's future government to accept Beijing's term of cross-strait relations. Now, will President Obama yield to Chairman Xi's pressure on Taiwan? In the following, I have 8 proposals to the United States. Number one, Obama administration must do away with a policy of appeasement or benign neglect to Taiwan. Benign neglect. Some people say that's intentional, no, benign. Well, we see that the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's article in Foreign Policy, America's Pacific Century, her book, Hard Choice, didn't mention Taiwan. And the new National Security Council advisor, Susan Rice, in her speech at Georgetown University in November 2013, policy towards East Asia didn't mention Taiwan at all. So this is benign neglect. Wow. You make your mind. Well, I believe that President Obama must recognize Taiwan's strategic importance and the vital role Taiwan can play in the U.S. pivot to Asia. A free, secure, and democratic Taiwan is in the best strategic interest of the United States, Japan, and other U.S. allies in Asia, and is just as critical as peaceful cross-strait relations for maintaining a secure Asia. Two, President Obama should tell Chairman Xi that in no uncertain terms that the Obama administration's staunch support for Taiwan's democracy and security. No intervention in Taiwan's election, be neutral. Third, the U.S. Congress ought to consider adopting a congressional resolution which will authorize U.S. government to defend Taiwan against external aggression and coercion in accordance with the Taiwan Relations Act, following the example of 1955 Formosan resolution. Fourth, robust U.S. China defense cooperation is indispensable. There have been no major foreign military sale to Taiwan since 2011 due to Beijing's pressure, and somehow Obama administration yield to that kind of pressure. So to strengthen Taiwan's ability to deter aggression and determine its fate free from intimidation, the United States should help Taiwan with advanced fighter jet, asymmetrical defense system like submarines, and improved missile technology, in addition to more frequent and higher level military dialogues. Number 5, support Taiwan's participation in the TPP, or a separate U.S.-Taiwan bilateral free trade agreement. 6, rebalance U.S. relation with Taiwan and remove outdated restriction and obstacle. The United States value Taiwan much more than Cuba. If President Obama wished to leave behind a positive and shining foreign policy legacy, then normalize relation with Taiwan. A vibrant democracy with 23 million people, more than population Australia. And Taiwan is America's 10th largest trading partner in the world. Is this more important than Cuba? If you can do something with Cuba, why not Taiwan? 7, don't demonize the DPP, Democratic Progressive Party, the principal opposition party in Taiwan, which most likely will come to power next January. An overwhelming majority of Taiwanese voters will vote for the DPP presidential candidate, Dr. Tsai Ing-wen, next January. Unlike the Kuomintang candidate, Ms. Hong Xiu-chu, a pro-China ideologue who favors cross-strait economic and political integration and call for ending U.S. arms sale to Taiwan and want to sign a peace agreement with China, Dr. Tsai will make Taiwan a worthy and trustworthy U.S. partner. Her policy statements on defense, economy, cross-strait relation, and other issues seems to have been well received in Washington in her trip in June. Well, I need not to summarize Dr. Tsai's recent speech at CSIS in June. I think U.S. government officials consider her policy statement during his trip here and meeting with the U.S. official constructive and reliable, and so that well received. Anyway, more think tanks in Taiwan's Green Camp support Dr. Tsai's policy platform and have also called for Taiwan's future government to increase Taiwan's annual defense spending to 3% of its GDP so as to demonstrate its commitment to Taiwan's own security and defense. The military balance of power in Taiwan Strait have been tilted towards China. Everyone knows that. And in the past 7-8 years, Taiwan's defense spending is only 2% of our GDP. Many people were unhappy and concerned that, we have not been careful enough about our own defense. Therefore, for new government to increase defense spending to 3%, that minimum we should do. Secondly, we should capitalize on Taiwan's advanced and sophisticated information technology to build up an internet army and prepare to wage a cyber warfare against external threat and attack in cooperation with the United States. Back in 2007, when the DPP government was in charge, it had an agreement with the United States to cooperate. And during the Ma administration, this appeared not to have been done. But if a new government came into office, we are going to place great emphasis on this. It's going to cause a fourth, branch of a military service, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Internet Army, number 4. We know this is all important. United States has been target of a cyber attack. Taiwan is the same. So we got to be able to defend ourselves and, if necessary, retaliate. So Taiwan must devise better and more effective counter-espionage measures to safeguard its national secret and military intelligence. Well, there's too many spies Chinese spies in Taiwan, and they infiltrate into our military government institution, and we got to do better job in defense against this kind of espionage attack. Number 4, Taiwan must liberalize its market and diversify its foreign trade and avoid over-dependence on China. During the last 8 years, Taiwan put all the eggs in one basket, that's China. And the people, last November, and the students' Sunflower Movement, it is a kind of a peaceful political uprising against Ma government for tilting too much towards China. And people in Taiwan are worried that China might do to Taiwan what the Russian did to Ukraine and Crimea. So many young people feel, yes, they have to stand up and tell the government, you've got to do more, and if you don't do more, then you are out. And this is going to happen next January. And finally, I feel that to revive Taiwan's struggling economy, our economy is very bad. Its future government needs a new thinking and an entirely new development strategy in a time of globalization. And we forget AIIB, Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, controlled by China, and focus on TPP. Taiwan is a member of the democratic community, and we certainly want to have an open market and liberalize the economic system. Thank you very much.
Seth Cropsey, you have a marvelous book, a bestseller, called Mayday, The Decline of American Naval Supremacy, with a whole chapter on China and the coming threats. You talk a lot about Taiwan, actually. You seem quite pessimistic that even without sequestration, the military balance, the naval balance at least, is slipping away from the United States. I wonder if I could ask you to talk about some of the material in this book as it's applied to Taiwan. It seems to me your 3 important jobs in the Pentagon, as Assistant to the Secretary of Defense, as Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, and as Acting Assistant Secretary for Special Operations, give you a special authority to talk about the military balance that we're, by law, the United States is required to sort of have the capacity to do certain things about Taiwan and to provide for Taiwan's self-defense. As I read your chapter 6 here, you're very critical of the United States' ability to be able to defend Taiwan today, and you're kind of warning your readers that the trend is not our friend. The trend is getting worse. Have I misread your chapter 6? Seth?
No. I'd like to say a couple of words about Taiwan and then address the particulars that you've asked me about, Mike. It's important in these discussions to recall that Taiwan is the United States, if I'm incorrect, somebody please correct me, is the United States' 10th largest trading partner. And that places it ahead of such states as Brazil and Italy, which, for example, exceed Taiwan in population, to say nothing of landmass, by magnitudes. Taiwan's free political institutions are an example that neither Chinese culture, tradition, nor characteristics stand in the way of democracy for China. Taiwan is located at the center of the first island chain, which is of incalculable strategic importance to the bilateral relations that the United States maintains with its Asian allies and partners, of which Taiwan is one. Taiwan is also the object of scores of mean-spirited, petty, bullying, and offensive efforts by China to isolate it from the international community and to prevent it from safeguarding the lives and liberty of its people. These issues are constant. The visit of China's President Xi Jinping to Washington raises them in the public's mind again. So does China's darkening economy, as Dr. Chang has referred to. Xi needs to take something away from this visit, positive. The Chinese Communist Party's claim to rule has been based on the country's economic fortunes of the past 25 years. The fortunes of China's equity and real estate markets, and the massive infusions of the Chinese central bank, including direct loans to state-owned banks, which in many cases are not performing, not returning what they've been loaned, into the country's economy raise very serious questions about whether China can sustain the growth of recent decades. The Guardian reported yesterday that China recorded its largest monthly fall in currency reserves, foreign currency reserves, $93.5 billion, as Beijing tried to stabilize the yuan's value and prevent capital flight. This was last month. If the communists cannot claim to govern because of their economic success, what then is the justification for their continued rule? Much of the answer is provided in the government's shift toward nationalism, the effort to represent itself as a protector against imaginary foreign threats. As a result, we saw a parade last week where ballistic and intermediate range missiles, along with armored and mechanized units, were paraded through Beijing, nominally to observe the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II. This is uncharacteristic. The Chinese communists did not fight the Japanese. The nationalist Chinese, the people who left for Taiwan, did. China also said that it would cut its ground forces by 300,000. Do not be taken in by this. A reduction in ground forces allows capital for modernization and advancing technologies in the Air Force sectors and in the Navy sectors. So if you think that this is a step toward peace or goodwill toward its neighbors, do not be deceived. On the same day, September 2nd, the day that marked the 70th anniversary of Japan's surrender, the Los Angeles Times reported that the Pentagon was now admitting that it had been tracking one Chinese amphibious ship, 3 surface warfare combatants, and a supply ship in the Bering Sea, the first time that the U.S. Defense Department had observed Chinese combatants off the Alaskan coast. On the following day, the U.S. press started to report on a reorganization of the Chinese High Command that will see power flow from regional commands to the center, thus giving Xi Jinping control of the military that has not been seen since Deng Xiaoping. Xi will become a more powerful, more dominant figure in the military of China, of the PLA. In strategic terms, These developments point toward tighter centralized control of a military which will benefit in modernization and advanced technology, as I said. They underline Chinese leadership's understanding that the basis of one-party rule must be expanded to include defense of the homeland, however specious their arguments may be. They imply that others in the region must take notice. Operationally, the appearance of a Chinese amphibious flotilla in the northern Pacific indicates that the mid-Pacific is now in play. It is in play in the strategic competition that Chinese words and actions demonstrate, but that American policymakers have yet to acknowledge. The mid-Pacific is important because at its center are the Hawaiian Islands, and because China's ability to project power beyond the first and second island chains means that they foresee a time when they can threaten both those bastions from the east and from the west. I'd like to address more specifically Michael's question. China has been building up its ballistic and intermediate range forces, including ballistic missiles, at 100 or 100 plus per year on the landmass across the strait from Taiwan. China is building not one or two, but several new classes of submarines simultaneously. By contrast, the United States is having difficulty funding one class, its only class of attack submarine, the Virginia class, and the question of a replacement to the aging Ohio class, the ballistic missile boat submarine, remains under review at Congress, and there is no answer yet, and I will return to that. Chinese policy has resulted in double-digit increases in their military budget going back several decades now. Its ballistic missiles are advertised to be able to enforce the access and area denial policy that is aimed to prevent the U.S. Navy from entering the West Pacific, and is also aimed at our other treaty allies in the first island chain and our base at Guam. Their intermediate range missiles exceed the range of the missiles carried aboard our ships today. You don't have to do the math to figure out what that means. They can hit us further away than we can come in to hit them. So there are several points that needed to be added here. These are my points. I have 5, and Parris, I hope to be, and the audience, I hope to be forgiven if our points overlap. First, the United States should assist Taiwan in every possible way with the modernization of its submarine force. Hostilities in the Strait of Taiwan, there would be 2 primary objectives of the PRC. One would be to blockade and cut off the commerce of Taiwan. The other would be to conduct amphibious landings. These would both be preceded by and included with assault by airplanes, fighter bombers, and ballistic missiles. Submarines would make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to conduct an amphibious landing. Submarines with certain kinds of weapons would also be effective in striking back against ballistic missile attacks from the mainland. Their torpedoes would be useful against ships that fire missiles against Taiwan. Second, Taiwan should be included in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And at the same time, the United States should declare its absolute commitment to Taiwan's security. Third, along with that statement of the United States' commitment to Taiwan's security, it is important, I think it is necessary, for the United States senior policymakers, that's the president, to restate publicly the strategic importance of Taiwan to preserving peace, democracy, stability, not only in Taiwan, but in all of Asia. The question here is not only Taiwan. Taiwan happens to be at the center. The question is all of Asia. Fourth, the United States needs to think itself about its own strategy toward China. This remains in flux, unstated, unclear, unspoken. That's not a good thing. I've written, and some of you may, a paragraph or two about it, and some of you may have seen Aaron Friedberg, Professor Friedberg from Princeton's article a couple of weeks ago, recommending that a solarium project be undertaken under direct presidential supervision, as President Eisenhower did at the beginning of the Cold War, to figure out what exactly the United States policy toward China should be. I think it's a sensible idea. I don't expect this president to do it, but I hope that the next president will look at that recommendation and take it very seriously. And by the way, Eisenhower was directly involved in the deliberations of the group, the Solarium Project, that set forth what was the containment strategy for the Soviet Union that lasted throughout the Cold War. Finally, as Michael was referring to earlier, the U.S. Navy is in a state of decline. The number of ships now is down to about 273. That's less than half of what it was at the end of the Cold War. A more sensible number would be about 350. There is no way that with the current budgets, we're going to reach 350 ships. The rebalance that is the Navy's part of the so-called rebalance toward Asia is meaningless. From a division of half the fleet in Asia and half the fleet in the rest of the world, the Navy's intention now is to distribute the fleet so that 60% is devoted to Asia and 40% to the rest of the world. Since that recommendation was announced, the Navy has decreased by about 10 ships, 10 combatant ships. The Congressional Budget Office says that there is a 25 to 30% gap between the amount of money that the Navy says it needs to fulfill its 30-year plan and traditional budgets that the Navy has received for shipbuilding, and what is absolutely required in order to fulfill the plan that exists right now. Somehow or other, that gap has to be breached, has to be overcome. So we have to get our own house in order, if we're going to make good not only on whatever one calls a pivot to Asia, but on the commitments that we have with our treaty allies in Asia. I think I've used up my time.
Thank you. Okay, 9 points, maybe 8 from Parris, 5 points from Seth Cropsey. Ian Easton, do you want to say a few words about your research at Project 2049 and reveal how many points you have?
Well, first of all, good morning. It is truly a privilege and a pleasure to be here at the Hudson Institute. And thank you to Dr. Pillsbury for the very kind invitation. And thank you for holding such a timely conference. I mean, this is a topic that I think has long deserved more attention in Washington and has not gotten the attention that it deserves. And I think this is purposeful. At least that's what I suspect. That the reason we haven't spoken more about the defense of Taiwan, the reason why we're seeing this massive Chinese military buildup, and we're not thinking about it in terms of what it means for the defense of Taiwan and for U.S. interests related to Taiwan, I think it has to do with perhaps a military and political deception operation that Beijing has put on. I can't prove that because I don't have any special insights into Beijing's motives, but I would just point out that since 2010, maybe 2011, America's best and brightest, our smartest geostrategic thinkers have increasingly looked towards the South China Sea. For them, and the many, I think, excellent products and books that have been written on this topic, the South China Sea is the new Fulda Gap, if you're familiar with that Cold War reference. That China's South Sea Fleet is the new Soviet Eighth Guard Army, if you will, according to this metaphor, that this is the future of conflict in the 21st century. But is it really? If the definition of military deception in this context is Chinese actions taken to deliberately mislead American decision makers, causing them to take specific actions or inactions that result in the achievement of China's mission, then could it be that the South China Sea is just but a distraction? Does China really care as much about the South China Sea or the East China Sea or the cyber domain as we do? Or do they really care about Taiwan? And has it influenced our own policies, our own force modernization, our planning assumptions, and our investments? I think it may have. If you look at the history of the short history of the pivot to Asia or the rebalance to Asia, a lot of it has actually been about the South China Sea. We've reopened Burma for business. We have relaxed the arms embargo on Vietnam, and Vietnam has now become something of a security partner. The U.S. Marine Corps now has a very strong presence in the Philippines and Australia, the U.S. Navy in Singapore. The horizons seem limitless for American geostrategic positioning around the South China Sea. But Taiwan has completely fallen off the map. That policymakers are not thinking about Taiwan, and they're not talking about Taiwan as a result. And it's not clear that the best and the brightest in the U.S. military, in the Pentagon and the Pacific Command, are thinking as much about Taiwan today as they were 10 years ago, even as the threat to Taiwan has increased at a remarkable pace. I would argue, and I posit, that China's military buildup is not really about the South China Sea. It's not about islands at all. It's not about sea lines of communication. And it's not even as much about the Navy as we think it is. That it's about Taiwan. The invasion and occupation of Taiwan is the core mission that drives China's military buildup. If you've read the recently published, or at least the recently publicly accessible Science and Military Strategy, it was published in December of 2013, and it's recently become available online. Anybody can read it. It's in Chinese, but it's very accessible. And other than that, and I think there are translated copies available, it makes clear that China's main strategic direction, which is what they call their fundamental driving national objective, is actually the subjugation or the annexation of Taiwan. Now, obviously, they would prefer it to be bloodless. They'd prefer it to happen in a peaceful way. But they're very much prepared to assume that it won't happen in that way, and they're preparing for that eventuality. And if you read the Science and Military Strategy, they actually go through the trouble of listing in some detail the missions, the top strategic missions in protocol order, which means in order of priority for the PLA. And the number one mission for the ground forces, the Army, which is really the star player in China's military system. It always has been, and it continues to be so because of the Taiwan mission and also the border defense mission. The Army's number one mission is Taiwan. The Navy, which follows the Army in terms of priority, the Navy's one mission, their number one mission is to support the invasion of Taiwan. The Air Force, PLA Air Force, their number one mission is Taiwan. In fact, their number two mission is also Taiwan. And the same with the Second Artillery. And so if their stated objectives are to get ready for the invasion of Taiwan at some point in the future, because they don't think they're ready today, and I think having done a bit of research on the topic and on Taiwan's defenses, it's clear that China is not able to threaten Taiwan with a credible invasion threat today, and it probably won't be for a long time to come. But if that's the mission, if that's the core driving mission that drives the PLA, and the military ramp up that we've seen, and it's not related to the maritime domain as much as the maritime domain is what drives our military expenditures, then I think there's a disconnect there. And I think that's important to take note of. And of course, if you read PLA, their internal writings related to Taiwan, it's clear that one of the reasons that the Army is so important and the reason they stay important in China's military system is because they would face the brunt of the battle, right? They would be responsible for actually fighting on the beaches and the coasts and then moving into Taiwan's dense urban areas, capturing the cities and the mountains, and then eventually assuming, and it's a big assumption, assuming victory, actually subjugating Taiwan and turning it into a Orwellian-esque police state in the end. That their objectives are actually stated in the open, that this is what drives them. But they know they're not ready. So it's a point of tremendous sensitivity and actually vulnerability that I think that we miss in terms of our relationship with China. That this is a point of potential leverage that the United States has. But we miss it because of this misdirection that has gone on. And part of it's related to Chinese misinformation operations, I think, here in Washington and around the world, and especially on Taiwan. So there's many myths that are out there about the defense of Taiwan. Myth number one, I think, is that the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, because of close economic and trade ties and people-to-people ties, that it's inevitable that sooner or later Taiwan will be absorbed into the PRC. Now, how that might happen, we're not exactly sure, but it's inevitable, according to Chinese propaganda, that sooner or later they will be able to unify with Taiwan. Now, in reality, if you look at the polling data, or if you go to Taiwan and speak to people, or if you look at the 9/1 election results, unification in any way, shape, or form has never been more unpopular, ever, than it is today. It's never been more unpopular for the citizens of Taiwan. Second myth is that the balance of military power has shifted decisively in China's favor. That is true if you only look at military budgets. If military budgets are your metric and the size of militaries are your metric, then it's true that the balance of power has shifted in China's favor. But China is not able to execute the invasion of Taiwan. And so if it's not able to, has the balance of power really shifted in a decisive way? If you look at the quality of the ROC military and the quality of the PLA military, and of course, it's hard to quantify that, right? It's because it's a very qualitative sense that you get in meeting PLA generals and meeting ROC generals. I can tell you from my own experience, I think there's a big difference in terms of professionalism. I think the PLA is far more corrupt than the ROC military. I think their training is subpar. And I think the fact that Taiwan has more military officers and soldiers training in the United States than perhaps any other foreign military in the world also gives Taiwan a tremendous qualitative advantage. You have to remember, in modern warfare, as we saw in the Persian Gulf War, quality matters a whole lot more than quantity. Now, everybody in the Pacific likes to say, well, and this is the obvious rebuttal, is quantity has a certain quality all of its own. That's true. But I think in terms of the defense of Taiwan, it's important to keep that in mind. And certainly from the PLA's perspective, in their own internal writings on the Taiwan campaign, they make it very clear that from their perspective, in many regards, Taiwan is getting better defended over time as a result of its own indigenous efforts, but also support from the United States. And so those are two important myths to keep in mind and to remember that I think, at least I would argue, that they're myths. Implications for the United States. What does it mean for us? Why is it important? Well, first and foremost, it's important because Taiwan is a democracy. Taiwan is a beacon for Chinese-speaking people the world over who want freedom and democracy and who value human rights. It is an absolute beacon, and that's also why it's such a threat to Beijing. So it's important for that reason, and that is the number one reason it's important. The secondary reason, of course, is U.S. national interest. We are now, whether we like it or not, engaged in a long-term, hopefully peacetime competition with the People's Republic of China. It's a political competition, it's an ideological competition, it's a military competition, and it's also an economic competition, as we've seen. Right? They don't steal our trade secrets because they're not competing with us. And so, as part of this competition, Taiwan is essential. And if you read writings that the PLA General Staff Department have produced on Taiwan's military geography, they make it very clear that from their perspective, until they can control Taiwan and turn it into a base of operations, they will not be able to break through the first island chain and then be able to dominate Japan and the Korean Peninsula and others. Then until they have that critical geography, then they're going to be in big trouble. That's their view. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind going forward. In terms of what we could do that we're not doing today, there's a lot, and I would just defer to the expertise of Dr. Chang and Cropsey on this. I absolutely agree with all their recommendations. In addition, I would state, or I would argue, that the commander of the Pacific Fleet and our PACOM commander, the 7th Fleet, they should all visit Taiwan, and they should get to know their counterparts. According to the Taiwan Relations Act, they are legally obligated to certify an ability to fight shoulder to shoulder, if ordered to by the president, to fight shoulder to shoulder with ROC military commanders. But yet they've never been to Taiwan. So if there's a crisis, if there's a fourth Taiwan Strait crisis, or if there's a war, the president here in Washington is going to be on the phone with commanders in Hawaii who, while otherwise superb, because I think they are superb, while otherwise superb, have no firsthand knowledge of the battlefield. None whatsoever. And I think it's an amazing and absurd situation that we're in, that we have that restriction that we've placed on ourselves in this regard. And so I would, in addition to arms sales and increased training and joint exercises and things of that nature, I would also point out the importance of the human software component, because quality is important. I think it's very important that folks out in Hawaii and also here in Washington at high levels rebalance in their minds and in their relationships towards the Taiwan Strait. And so I will conclude with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we promised you we would adjourn by 12:15, so we have 17 minutes for questions. I noticed, just to help you formulate your questions, I noticed some overlap between all three experts, especially one of Parris Zhang's points about obsolete restrictions or ending or perhaps softening or loosening restrictions on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship. And then Ian Easton also mentioned a specific example that U.S. military leaders responsible for the Pacific have not visited Taiwan. I think the exception is after they retire. Sometimes they go over on delegations sponsored by the Project 2049.
Whenever we can.
I would like to add one thought as you formulate your questions. This topic that Parris Chang raises of restrictions on the U.S.-Taiwan relationship is actually, in my experience in the government, something our media and think tanks know almost nothing about. It's very difficult to find an expert who can list, for example, and try this sometime. Say, what do you think are the top 10 restrictions on U.S.-Taiwan relations between our two governments? And what you'll usually find out is the person you're asking doesn't know of any restrictions. Or if they do, they are vaguely aware that Taiwan's president can't come to Washington, D.C., and American visitors above the level of, say, cabinet secretaries or military generals and admirals cannot visit Taiwan. That's about the extent of it. It's very little known and a topic for future research. What are these restrictions? When were they established? Because many of them were established in 71, 72. More were established in 78, 79, and more have been added. The restrictions, just to give you some flavor of the problem, the United States government doesn't recognize Taiwan as a government or as a country. That's a pretty big restriction. No American official can actually write directly to Taiwan. So there's no official communications. It has to go through non-government bodies. Taiwan's armed forces are not part of official American military operations. When I've been to visit Taiwan with U.S. senators, for example, the plane would drop the senators off, the Air Force plane, and it had to fly someplace else overnight, as long as the senators were in Taiwan, and then come back and pick them up. I would say there's more than 20 restrictions like this. And part of the restrictions are to not talk about Taiwan. So when you hear, as Parris Chang mentioned, Susan Rice's speech at Georgetown almost 2 years ago on Asia, Taiwan's not there. As Parris said in Hillary Clinton's book, where she's basically saying her greatest achievements were in Asia. She has a very long chapter on Asia, how her being Secretary of State there was crucially important. There's no mention of Taiwan. Now, there's a reason for this. The more there's discussion of Taiwan, the more it risks inflaming Chinese nationalism and Chinese hardliners. The more pressure it puts on the moderates, the more informed the American Congress will become. There was a time when the American Congress had to put extreme pressure on the Pentagon and State Department because the Congress found out it did not even know what Taiwan's arms sale requests were. The list was being given by Taiwan. Congress wasn't told. Even today, this has not been fully resolved. So you have a big unknown here that none of the four of us have addressed. What is the nature of the restrictions between the U.S. and Taiwan? And one thing I'll close with this point. In lots of summit visits and negotiations and the 3 joint communiques that govern our relationship with China, each time there's another summit, the Chinese focus, as Parris Chang has mentioned, might happen this time on a little more concessions from the Americans about Taiwan, but not in public. So, does anybody have any questions? I see the first hand up way back in the back.
Tall person here. Real quick, but I just want to focus a little bit on the economic comment, particularly the Trans-Pacific Agreement. My own view, as being the last negotiator with Taiwan, has been that you're not going to get the other countries to go along with it, but under fast track, there's nothing to prevent the U.S. from negotiating a separate free trade agreement with Taiwan, which can very well parallel what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership along the line. And then quickly on the question of how do you deal with China, I remember Taiwan. I remember I was completing negotiations with them, and I got a note from the State Department saying you have to meet with them in the Exchange restaurant, which was across the street from USTR, and then after I was, my final trip, I was giving a speech, and state said, you're not allowed to be here, and with that, they really moved me out very quickly. So I definitely am not sure how you will do your communication. But I think the idea with the Trans-Pacific and a quick FTA can be included in a couple of presidential platforms that will not be unhelpful. Thank you.
Why don't we get a few more questions and then you, as experts, figure out which ones you want to answer. Okay, a lady back here in the black dress.
Thank you. My name is Chi Ning Nguyen, with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. Thank you, Dr. Pillsbury, for bringing up the restrictions. And thank you, Dr. Chang, for talking about all the 9 points and all of the panelists. My question has to do exactly with the importance of Taiwan in the global, especially in the Asia Pacific, and especially now in the South China Sea issue. Because Dr. Chang, would you clarify with us the 11-dash map that originated from the Republic of China, the Taiwan, and what does it have to do with the 9-dash line map? And if Dr. Easton and Dr. Cropsey can talk about the new man-made islands and how is that affecting the security of the whole region, and the Taiwan islands, the key position of it, how would that fit into the whole pictures? And we as Southeast Asia nations, especially I'm from Vietnam, we invite Taiwan to be with us, to be part of us, oh, the island chain. You in the critical position of the first island chain we talk about. And you are very critical as our partners in the TPP, if you would join us. So what would the position of Taiwan be with ASEAN if there is a change in the
Okay,
region?
let's try to get two more questions.
Thank you.
Nadia in the front row here. Nadia Tao.
Hi, Nadia with the Liberty Times. I have a question that Dr. Chen and other people mentioned when President Xi visits Washington, he might press hard on Taiwan to achieve some major points so he can bring victory home. But from Obama's point of view, what's the incentive for the U.S. government to give those big points for Xi Jinping? Thank you.
I'm looking for media people. Last chance for media questions.
Yeah, Tina Chong with Voice of America's China branch. My question is on the military parade. Have you seen any weapon system or anything that is the most concern to Taiwan, or is it the things or weapons that we don't see that's most worrisome? Thank you.
Okay.
Well, the weapon that we don't see on the parade that's very hard to, it's invisible, is cyber warfare. And that's a big problem because the U.S. military relies on network-centric warfare, which is based on computers and satellites more heavily than any military in the world. So that's a big issue. And we do not have a declarative policy, as we do, for example, in with nuclear deterrence, on what our actions, what the United States would do if there were a massive cyber attack against us or our allies. So any country, and that leads, that uncertainty is an encouragement to try something. So we didn't see that, and that's a very serious issue. What we did see was ballistic missiles whose advertised ability is to be able to hit, to strike and either sink or put out of commission an American aircraft carrier at a distance up to and beyond 1,000 nautical miles. And those were paraded down the streets of Beijing, along with a lot of other lesser range missiles that, although they are lesser range, are still greater in range than the surface-to-surface missiles that we have. And as I mentioned in my remarks, you can figure out what that means.
Ian, do you want to be next and let Dr. Parris Chang have the final word as our guest from afar?
Absolutely.
This is a very Confucius expression. You know how wonderful it is to have a guest from afar be with us. That's a loose translation from Confucius.
Well, what struck me about the parade, and it's a great question, it's very, very timely, and it's very visible, right? What struck me is the political threat, actually, to Taiwan. It's the PRC taking credit for the accomplishments of the ROC government during World War II and pretending that they were a U.S. ally. They didn't even exist. The PRC didn't exist during World War II. And they're trying to pretend as if they did, and taking credit for all the hard work of the ROC government, and which still exists in Taiwan today. And so there's that threat, the threat of marginalization. There's also the threat of professionalism. What the parade showed was a certain measure of professionalism. It was very impressive, actually. And that in and of itself is a threat to Taiwan. Because again, Taiwan's greatest weapon, aside from the United States, which is truly Taiwan's nuclear deterrent, if you will, its greatest weapon is its qualitative advantage over a quantitatively massive PLA. And so the idea that the PLA is going to downsize, that they're going to cut 300,000 troops, to me that suggests that they're going to be a smaller, more lethal force that's actually more professional going forward. And I think that's worrisome. In terms of U.S. incentives to accommodate China during the visit, I don't see any at this point. There's very little incentive, I should think, in Washington to accommodate China after the cyber breaches that have happened, after the man-made island construction that we've seen in the South China Sea, and other things. I just don't see reasons why anybody would want to accommodate Xi Jinping at this juncture. And then how are the man-made islands affecting security situation in the South China Sea? There's no question that they are. But again, I think that is really the junior battlefield, if you will. The main battlefield going forward, I believe, and the one that we need to get smart on because there's a growing asymmetry of knowledge and information between the PLA, who has legions of Taiwan experts and experts on Taiwan scenarios, and the Pentagon, who now has a dwindling handful of Taiwan experts. That's a growing asymmetry that we need to worry about. And I think that is, if any place in the world stands a chance of being a very dangerous battleground going forward, and one that we need to think a lot about, it's that. South China Sea secondary, and of course the South China Sea affects the Taiwan Strait a lot in many ways. And so I think that is quite worrisome.
My really deep concern is Obama administration understand who is your friend, who is your enemy. That's really the key. And up to now, I don't think Obama administration has made up that mind. Is China really friend, partner? So the question from Liberty Times, whether Obama administration will accommodate Xi Jinping during the trip. I'm less optimistic as you are whether he would really stand up. I hope he would, but I am worried that really Xi Jinping is going to push hard. This is first state visit, and he cannot lose face, and he needs U.S. help to strengthen his position back home. So he is going to work very hard. And Taiwan, of course, is the key issue for them. Keep the Kuomintang in power, intervene in Taiwan's election again, and let Taiwan's future government don't go for independence and stay as China's appendage. So this is the kind of thing that China wants, and hope that the American decision maker will finally recognize Taiwan's significance, factor into the American balance to Asia, In such a way, I'm sure, we can do better job in keeping peace and stability in Asia and Pacific. Thank you.
I have some good news for you. It's 12:15, so we're on time. And the other bit of good news, I want to reassure you, if there's any pro-China people in the audience, the president of Hudson Institute, Ken Weinstein, and I went over to Beijing for a week about 2 months ago. We met about 10 of their major think tanks, some government officials, some military hardliners. And Hudson Institute is now going to be involved in a number of joint research projects with our counterparts, if we can say that word, Seth, in Beijing. And they continually raise a kind of suspicious set of questions about America's policy toward Taiwan. So I would conclude by saying, even though when our government mentions the rebalance to Asia, we don't mention Taiwan, even though when our major speeches about China and Asia are made, we don't mention Taiwan, it's clearly on the minds of senior Chinese strategic thinkers. And I think that's one reason we wanted to have this panel today and give a chance to three leading experts to talk about the Taiwan factor. So let's thank them all very much.